Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences patented technology protects any application against any attack with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Signal Sciences. As the world of software-driven everything becomes a reality and development cycles speed up, sales teams are taking a new approach to application security, one that enables security teams to scale by empowering developers to integrate security into their development workflows and toolsets, all while giving security teams the visibility and control they need. Snyk helps software-driven businesses develop fast and stay secure with a developer-first solution that seamlessly and proactively finds and fixes vulnerabilities in open-source libraries and containers. Learn more and see the solution for yourself at securityweekly.com/Snyk.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman and John Kinsella. We are looking for high-quality guest suggestions for our Enterprise Security Weekly podcast to fill our upcoming recording schedule. We're committed to educating and providing entertainment for the InfoSec community, and we would love to hear from you about who you would like us to interview on the show. Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and submitting the form. We review suggestions monthly and will reach out to you once reviewed. Join us at InfoSec World 2020, June 22nd to 24th, now at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort. Security Weekly listeners save 15% off the InfoSec World Main Conference or World Pass. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW2020. Click the register button to register with our discount code or the schedule button to sponsor a micro interview. And that brings us, Matt and John, to the news of the week. One at the top of the list, and not too coincidental that I've been playing a little bit of Animal Crossing myself, but Nintendo confirms breach of 160,000 accounts. Now, we always drop in breaches, and there were other breaches in the news related to, once again, Elasticsearch being open. This one was a little bit interesting, and I wanted to highlight because it was actually, per the article, in the legacy authentication endpoint for this. And it just kind of highlights one of those aspects that you can have a strong new service, a new API being developed, but if you're not paying attention to that legacy and accruing that tech debt or accruing, call it security debt as well, then unfortunately you may have, that may come back to bite you in cases just like this.
Yep, having old endpoints sitting around. I mean, luckily, this was only 8% of their user base. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, because I think they have like something like 20 million users or something like that. So it wasn't a full disclosure. It was just like 8%.
Right. 8%. And again, too, for one of the things that whenever we bring up Microsoft vulnerabilities, one of the things that really hurts them is that called either legacy support or backwards compatibility. It just makes things extra difficult, as we're seeing here in the Nintendo example.
I have to say, I was a little happy. This was one of the first medium-sized dumps which have come out in a while where I've never had a Nintendo account. So it's a breach where my data isn't in there for once.
Yeah, and I don't think my son uses he has the Switch, so I don't think he's in this one either, because I think the games he's playing is not using this old endpoint. So
yeah, this was for older, like the older 3DS system, so it should be fine on the Switch. No worries there. One of the other articles, also sort of on a theme of vulnerabilities, was an article talking about the NSA had published some guidelines or guidance on web shells. And this is a bit of a reference back to, we talked about web shells back in episode 95, I believe. So it was back in February, which feels about 20 years ago by now. In this case, it is a couple examples of how to look for, or common concepts of how to look for particular web shells, whether it's going to be file integrity monitoring, anomalous requests, things like that. So this article and the GitHub repo that it points to They're pretty simple approaches, I would say. They're more of here's how to review for a single web server or a single web application, as opposed to a fleet of them. Or these techniques don't necessarily, you'll run into scaling problems, I guess is what I'm getting to here. But it still is nice to see a mix of both looking at PowerShell tools. I mentioned Splunk, I mentioned this using grep. So kind of a point of interest for those of you curious about how web applications are compromised and then post-compromise exploitation and data exfiltration, for example.
Yeah, I was going through this list because we've seen some of these attacks, like WordPress plugins and those sorts of things, right? That creates one of these common cases. But there's also some interesting ones. Obviously, you've got SharePoint here, you've got Adobe in here, Microsoft Exchange Server, right? So it's not always just things like your WordPress website. There are other ways to create these same kind of vulnerabilities and attacks.
That's a great point, and that list, especially what you just rattled off, is a lot of enterprise software, and especially now with much more work from home, remote work, that call it beyond core, zero trust, et cetera, there's the potential for these to be exposed to the internet. Now, obviously, the idea that you're exposing them is that you're building better client trust and how the authentication is happening and so on. But you still need to have some monitoring and some logging on those server-side endpoints just to make sure that you can actually detect and respond when something goes bad.
Yeah. And if you're using all the Splunk queries, then Splunk will be happy because paying a bunch of money for Splunk.
The PDF that the report those guys have out it looks pretty good. The first 4 pages, cover what we sort of talk about week after week, like how to secure, what should you be securing, what should you be looking for. A little more on the operational side, I guess, than the ASW, but it's a pretty quick read for those who want to come up to speed in this type of thing.
Yeah, not quite as long as the 500-page plus reading assignment we gave you a couple weeks ago with the Google SRE book. So yeah. We'll go easy on you this week. We'll end the month that way. Speaking of which, before we go into, for example, some design patterns and APIs, here since we're talking about working from home, Matt, you flagged an interesting article about how productive software developers are or reportedly are right now.
Yeah, I was doing my research for Business Security Weekly, which is later today, and I ran across this article. I go, this is an interesting one to cover on Application Security Weekly because it's a survey of 324 developers to kind of gauge some of the concerns during work at home and in this remote work environment. And I thought some results were interesting. Nearly 1/3 of software developers, 31%, say working during a pandemic has them feel less productive. Now, I know in the case of Paul, that's not true. Paul is cranking code like crazy because he's having like a field day in the office by himself with Johnny. He's just cranking code. So he's not less productive, but in general, people feel they're less productive. And then it talks about the work hours, right? 1 in 4 say they're working later hours, while 33% are working longer hours. And I can see that. Work at home creates some very interesting shifts in your work behaviors, right? You might be working later, but you're also typically working longer. You don't have a commute now. It's a lot easier to sit in your office and just go, right? So these are trends I would expect. And with those, you would think if they're working longer hours, they should be more productive, but they feel less productive. So I'm curious, Mike, are you less or more productive these days?
Well, considering there's 3 of us on the podcast, 1/3 of us at least has to say less productive. So I'll take the fall and say I'm less productive. But it is pretty true that it is definitely harder to be equally productive, I will say, which is the same way to say less productive. Part of that is a little bit just when we're talking with Avi and having those threat modeling discussions, it's harder to have a richer discussion that is free flowing on a video chat, for example, because and everyone, attentive listeners may notice it can be a little bit harder to interject, and every once in a while you're stepping on someone else speaking, and you don't always get those visual cues or some of those quieter verbal cues that someone's about to talk. So it does put a lot more, especially if you're on the security team and you're kind of trying to moderate a discussion. There's a lot more effort that goes into moderating those discussions, as well as it's just a lot harder to have those, before lunch, afternoon coffee kind of chats about whether it's work related or, for that matter, not work related, just building the relationship with that dev team, DevOps team, security. So those things are definitely missing. But on the other hand, there's a lot of, tools like Slack make it really easy to stay in touch. And there's a lot of documentation that's being written. And I will say there, I'm not a fan of documentation for documentation's sake. But if you're putting something together that's concise and focused, or you're throwing an agenda into your meeting, I think that can make that time a lot more efficient. And that way, if you are feeling less productive, maybe then you can take some of that mental space and just say, you know what, here's my strict barrier that 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. rolls around. And in fact, it's actually time to stop working rather than stay tethered to your particular laptop or your desk or your working area just because you're only, more than 5 or 10 feet away from it after hours, so to speak.
Yeah. Hey, we're professionals, by the way, and the three of us still have to figure out how to, interact together. Can you imagine a video call with dozens of people on it? It's really hard to interact.
Well, you sort of see it if either of you guys have done those. And one of the tricks to if you're trying to get your word out on this type of in a meeting like this, you just learn to talk over other people, like I just did to Matt. But one of the things where I've seen the larger groups is when, like, if you're doing like a happy hour, a Zoom happy hour with your buddies, and there's like 10 boxes on your screen. Yeah, that gets sort of difficult. I can't imagine being in a large meeting at work. I mean, I guess the all hands, you just go into a broadcast mode. But yeah, I don't know. The big thing for me is not so much, at least what I figured out over the years working from home, is not so much the interaction with other people is not that bad. But for me, it's figuring out what point in the day am I most effective? When can I really actually get stuff done and not start trailing off into la la land? And usually for me, it's either really early morning or really late at nighttime. Middle of the day tends to be, I guess, between meetings, and then just like all sorts of, things catch my eye. So that's sort of, once I figured that out, that's where the best thing is for me to focus on, or to get the focus. That helped a lot.
Yeah, the only good news out of this survey is only 10% of developers are worried about running out of toilet paper.
Yeah, well, that's because probably most of them have all these stacks of outdated textbooks anyway. So
that's why you have a bookshelf, John. It's in case you run out of toilet paper.
That's why it's empty now.
It's called threat modeling. So speaking of working from home, though, there has been some positive aspects. So I did flag one. Both GitHub repo and streaming cast that Maddie Stone did. So this is someone, she is works at Google, and she did a online live stream, which is recorded now, for about Android app reverse engineering. So if you have some spare time and you just want to learn more about Android app reverse engineering, both her GitHub repo as well as the live stream are great resources. I think some of the stream was a bit cut off, so she will hopefully go back and re-record some of it. But that's a great resource for learning. She does give a shout out to Amanda Rousseau, Malware Unicorn, for those of you who follow her on Twitter, who's done also just more general reverse engineering labs like this. And if you're also continuing to be interested on the attacking aspect, we've mentioned Azaria Labs, who has done both online resources as well as some tutorials on ARM. For ARM exploitation. So there are a lot of resources out here that if you feel your mind wandering off, trying hard to focus on something, perhaps dive into one of these because they're very well presented, and obviously they're very important and good aspects of application security.
And you never know, you might get some bug bounties to offset some of your other work activities.
Yeah, it seems like there's a bit of a trend going around. This is an older one, but I didn't throw it in the notes because I thought it would have been past tense, but Microsoft's a bit over a year ago did a really great write-up on Finfisher. And I think a lot of us probably looked over it at the time, but it's another of these reverse engineering papers, but it's talking about reverse engineering a little more modern than like some of the older stuff from a decade or so ago, but how they had to actually go through and reverse engineer malware that had its own virtual machine in it. So maybe we'll add that into the notes as well. All this type of stuff I love. It's super cool, that whole cat and mouse thing to me, and being able to reverse this stuff.
It is very cool. And then, we'll find this application security angle to it. But, speaking of Nintendo and emulators, there's also a lot of interesting reverse engineering that's gone into a lot of video games, both to patch long-standing, 20, 30-year-old bugs so that people could complete particular levels or even fix particular graphic hiccups. So we'll have to throw together. We'll find some way to work this in for sure. And speaking of bug bounties are always going to be, maybe not profitable, but bounties to be found because developers are writing code, and those code have bugs. And in this case, I came across a article from NCC Group about code patterns for API authorization problems, or possibly these are basically preferred design patterns to better approach API authorization models. And it stood out to me because that's an area that's harder to automate from a black box perspective. You can automate it to a degree from your QA team, from your development team as they're building tests because they understand what those assumptions are. So there's our assumptions callback from our discussion with Avi. But this was pretty cool. And, it calls out 4 different patterns: an ad hoc pattern, which I honestly see quite a bit, a route-based pattern, a centralized pattern, and an object-based pattern. The centralized and object-based, I think I just personally have seen a bit more of. And regardless of these, the 3 approaches other than ad hoc, a lot of them really, one of the underlying themes is you have to pay attention and continue to maintain them because they go stale over time. And just as the Nintendo article showed us, that you can have a nice centralized model, but if you don't centralize all of the things, meaning pulling up your legacy APIs, you're still going to have some of those crusty areas of code and be paying a bounty or suffering from a breach.
Yeah, it's same as you, Mike. A lot of this sort of resonated with me. What I was trying to do is I sort of reread this morning, and I still haven't quite wrapped my head around it, but I'm trying to think through this article from the point of view. When I look at this right now, I think about, usually I want to try and pick one of those patterns at the beginning of a project, right? I'm used to smaller or newer projects, not something that's 20 years old. But I'm trying to take a step back and think, okay, I've come in and I've got this mess of 2 or 3 of these different patterns. How do I take this article and actually, it's not giving hints, and that's not what it's trying to do. It's just talking about the patterns. But what's next step once you recognize those patterns? How can you sort of boil them down and focus into 1 or 2 of them? I think that's something for people to think about.
It is, and you're kind of leading into the aspect. One of the recommendations it makes at the end is, start with a simple design, match the use case. So it's not saying here are 4. This is the best for this is best for this. Just choose one or recognize one that's beginning to emerge from your design discussions, from your architecture. But then also make sure it can scale. And make sure it can scale is a bit of a hand wavy, is sort of saying make sure it's secure, because it does take a lot of experience, a lot of insight to figure out what does it mean to scale, and is it scaling based on traffic, like queries per second, or is it scaling across the number of multiple services it needs, or is it scaling across the complexity of the authorization grants or your user population. So while I think that's a great recommendation, it does it definitely covers or papers over a lot of important questions that are specific to what you're actually building. But I will say the other one that is the recommendation down at the end is keep the logic auditable so you can easily identify places where the auth might be missed or bypassed. And that also kind of, I think, speaks more to what Avi was saying when you're capturing these discussions from threat modeling exercises, rather than just filling out checkboxes, putting that in a doc and filing that doc away, try to either document within the code or make the code, part reflect what the outcome of those or concerns of those threat model discussions have been. Again, it's a lot easier to say than to do, but I think that one particular recommendation really also stood out and resonated with me.
Well, the other thing is this is the point where you need to have a valid QA check as part of regression testing to make sure that it's not missed or bypassed, right? We've talked a lot about our internal test we now have because Paul bypassed authentication, right? And so that's a really good way to also validate this last assumption is have good test cases in place to look for where authorization is missed or bypassed so that you catch it and it doesn't become an issue in your code later.
Yeah. And so that, speaking of missing stuff and it doesn't become an issue in your code later, there's another article that I pulled about the health prognosis, if I can get that word out, sorry, of Internet of Medical Things. So this is IoT for the medical space. And I liked this article because it was repeating what we possibly initially are already going to say, that there's out-of-date code or code is poorly written or code hasn't been well tested for these devices. But it has some interviews or some quotes from Josh Corman, from I Am the Cavalry. And he's been in this space quite a bit. And he has some good quotes that one is also getting rid of what can also be a common misconception or perhaps a mythology within the security community or the IoT community that if you have patching any of these devices means they have to be completely go through an entire accreditation process again. And his point is it's saying addressing security flaws isn't really changing the intended use of this device. So it's not like saying that just because you have a flaw that needs to be patched means you have another multi-year process to go fix that device. So that's a little bit of a canard or a false flag or a false concern when talking about the security of medical IoT devices.
And this is not just medical IoT devices. This is all IoT devices. There's a whole class that falls into this realm of the same basic security issues, right? Now, the focus is on medical because we're talking about a lot of people supposedly, in hospitals right now and all these medical devices. But this proliferates well beyond just medical devices.
Yeah, I think the other thing that stood out to me here too is that it's easy to highlight medical devices because you can focus more on the risk when something goes wrong. But there's another quote too here is that stepping back a little bit and doing a threat modeling, if you will, is that a lot of these hospitals, the healthcare providers, obviously yes, they don't have really good network segmentation. There's a lot of risks around these devices, but they're also dealing with ransomware and phishing and other very common, very basic attacks that aren't unique to either IoT or the healthcare space for that matter. So it's also to say we need to have to put these into perspective about where would we invest a lot of our efforts or where do we know where some gaps are to figure out where security budget needs to be spent.
I think one of the things I'm having a hard point with this article, and we touched upon this a little bit when we had Tim Mackey on from Synopsys. As you're saying, Mike, I think this is ages ago, probably February. Feels like 5 years. But so, I mean, the question in my head right now, and I was asking some of the OWASP guys this last week, one of them they've got a new paper out around IoT as well. What is an IoT device? In this article, they start talking about Windows 95 and XP, and I'm like, how do you call that IoT? I call that a device on a cart that you bought 20 years ago,
and you haven't replaced.
Yeah, and it's not. And that's okay. I mean, that's a problem. It needs to be taken care of. But it seems like everyone's just doing a big old bear hug and calling it IoT. To me, IoT, and I think I need to go looking for a NIST definition to go and back me up on this or something, but I think of it as a lightweight, smaller device, usually that's either a sensor or something like that is, it still has all these problems we're talking about. But I think once you sort of categorize it and put it like that, it allows you to address or think about this problem in a lot more focused manner. Because when you think about everything from the crash cart with Windows 95 to the Fitbit, or whatever the equivalent is on a patient in ICU nowadays, that allows you to bring that range down and have a lot more, I think, a better conversation about it and start fixing problems which exist today. Because I think the problems which an IoT developer in 2020 are dealing with, how do you patch things? How do you do all these things we're talking about? That can be focused on a lot tighter if you leave the noise of, oh my God, Windows 95 out of it. So I think it helps in some form and makes the article a little bit longer, but I would really like to see people focus down on that a little bit tighter.
IoT is defined as the new cool embedded device. I mean, you think of it as an embedded device. That's the way I think of these things, right? It is a set of chips that have software components and some hardware chip components, but not your traditional operating system, typically, that are communicating via wireless, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, whatever, right? That's how I kind of classify these devices. And when you think about the ones in the medical area, you've got pacemakers and all kinds of other of these types of devices that are vulnerable. You've got imaging equipment for CAT scans, MRIs, all kind of fall into this because they may not have a traditional operating system in them. They might, but they might be, the way they work might be a little different. So, to me, this is really an embedded device issue more than it is a traditional operating system issue. And so I'd like to see the two kind of, each one can be addressed slightly differently, but each one has its nuances.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting back to with I'll remember now when I engaged OWASP on a CSA list, they are releasing a version of GOAT for IoT, and they had no Bluetooth support, but they were talking about SQL injection. If your IoT device is vulnerable to SQL injection or cross-site scripting, and again, I love OWASP. We just had more of those guys on. We had them on last week. We love everything about them. But this is, I think we need to, I don't think it's nuanced. I think it's a little more, needs to be a little bit better structured. But yeah, anyways.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm going to have to find out, because I want to say there is a NIST standard or NIST recommendations that I had come across that was talking about specifically patching the TLS setup, also the not having a default password or having a random password per device. So we'll have to find that out. Or those of you listeners who are shouting at your device, listening to us as we say this, please let us know. Send an email, send a tweet, ping us on LinkedIn so we can throw that in the show notes or talk about it in one of the upcoming shows. And I did. I'm struggling to get a good segue here to the final article I had, but I did pull out one article that ties back to a little bit of the threat modeling, but more about handling postmortems and incident response. And I've mentioned a couple times in the past few episodes, as the theme of this episode is, years ago it feels like, but about the idea of a blameless postmortem. And this article I linked to, I think, helps clarify a little bit about what blameless actually means. It doesn't mean without consequences, which I think is important, but it also says focus when you're doing a postmortem or a bug happened and this bug caused, it impacted the traditional triad of, confidentiality, integrity, availability of a system, or if you want to go into stride or something else, an incident or a breach occurred. Focus on, are you identifying a flaw, or can you identify a flaw that happened where the process failed the person, or did the person not follow the process, or was there a lack of tooling? And I think this helps call out exactly what it means what it mean more when it's saying a blameless postmortem, and a postmortem that is focused on diving in, taking responsibility, saying something bad happened. In other words, rather than that threat modeling question, what could go wrong? Something did go wrong. So now you're answering that fourth question of how did we do? Or in that discussion with Avi, that normal development feedback cycle, what happened? How can we fix it? So for that matter, I thought this was a pretty good article, not too long. And especially as we're all working in a distributed model, a postmortem document that's nice and clear and structured like this perhaps can help in these types of scenarios.
And we have a perfect example of what not to do. Ready? We sincerely apologize for any inconvenience caused and concern to our customers and related parties, according to Nintendo. In the future, we will make further efforts to strengthen security, ensure safety, so that similar events do not occur.
Yeah. This is actually really important to me. It's at previous orgs I've really tried to push for that blameless, just retrospective. If an organization isn't actually looking and learning, and they're just going, okay, cool, we're back up, let's keep going, that's a really bad thing. It's like, if you don't stop and go, how can we improve to make sure this doesn't happen again? Yeah. Wow, that's an unfortunate situation to be in. I've seen it, unfortunately. And I think sometimes people really want to do it, but they're either afraid, either culturally or whatever reason. But you need to get folks in a room or on a Zoom or whatever have you, and say, hey, there's no blame. No one's going to get fired. We're not going to look badly upon you. We're not going to make you wear the polka dot shirt. I guess that's good in Tour de France, but we want you just to, how can we make this better? How can we all learn from this? I really wish more orgs did this. Yeah.
Yeah, and we've seen a couple of these very positive examples publicly posted as well from everyone from, off the top of my head, Twitter's done this. I believe Netflix has, Cloudflare, Google. So these are very common names that people have heard about. And already, if these large organizations or medium organizations, if they're going to have flaws and talk about it in healthy, constructive manners, very much to your point, John, it's we should be having these conversations soon and early about what went wrong and how can we fix it. So with that said, John, Matt, I want to say that I take your co-hosting here very seriously, and I don't want to cause any of our listeners any inconvenience, but I do hope that they'll join us next week. So thanks, Matt. Thanks, John. Thank all of you listeners. We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.